Welcome back to the Daily Vent. So, today's note. They all want you to think something. But what do you think? Everybody's pushing a narrative. They probably want everyone to agree with them and support them. But what do you think for yourself? There is truth and there is lie. Figure out which is which. Figure out which is which. So, it's pretty simple, I guess. Propaganda, information, influence is everywhere in modern society. You could argue it always is. Nothing's new under the sun. Things have been here in various forms for probably pretty much ever. People influencing other people, right? Or things, forces, whatever, influencing people and their decisions. Branding, right? Even slogans, music, etc., entertainment. So I think it's worth noting that there is some nuance to things, right? So there is truth and there is lie. That's what I've written here. And there's a kind of a contention maybe between people that are very black and white versus people that are more nuanced and gray. You could argue the main problem, there's many problems. One of the problems with society nowadays is they kind of want you to think that everything is gray, but that's also in this, is the proper term postmodernist, whatever it's called for the modern way that society acts with it's all your truth and it's all subjective and everything is subjective, right? And I think that one of the main things is that there's kind of there's no really acceptance of a true moral standard beyond the self, beyond what each person thinks and chooses to think. And in reality, I don't believe that that's true. But it's weird because this was something that was kind of brought up recently with Candace Owens did an episode where she basically just interviewed her husband on her show. And at one point he brings up something along the lines of how throughout the time when they were going to debates and all these other things, there was I don't remember exactly how he put it, so I suggest you watch the episode. But it was something to the effect of that there was a lacking of a moral foundation or truth in the conversation, something like that. And I just want to pull up the actual episode for you here. So it would have been this one here. Okay, so swap over screens real quick. So this one right here, where she titles it "Meet My Husband, George Farmer," Candace, episode 119. I suggest you watch that episode because at some point George talks about this, where the idea is that in modern debate, it almost feels like it's assumed that you are to debate things based on a secular logic finding way of thinking, where they almost I think I don't know if anybody says this, or maybe this is implied based on how people might dismiss you if you encounter the conversation from a religious or moral, traditional, biblical, etc. point of view. Then you're almost viewed as being archaic or out of touch in your train of thought, not with it, so to speak, right? So feel free to just call out cringe where need be, or call out the ridiculousness for the sake of the truth, right? Because the idea, if we play into that, then it's a losing battle. Because basically if they do mean this, whoever they is, if they do mean this, that as soon as you give into discussing things from a biblical framework, if they view that as less intellectual or less reality-based, then isn't this all just kind of maybe part of a spiritual psyop? Have you heard that phrase where the most clever thing the devil ever did is convince you that he never existed? Is that essentially just boil it down to being that simple, where if you let them make you think that as soon as you entertain the fact that there might be a spiritual basis, there is a spiritual basis to everything that we do, and as soon as you start talking about it from that framework of it being at the core spiritual issue and problem and spiritual solution, and if you let them make us think that there's less merit in discussing it from that perspective, then we might very well be letting ourselves be psyoped. Because if we just attack everything from, or if we debate everything from only their terms, right? Because you're kind of letting them set the terms, where you have to discuss from a secular, logical point of view. Okay, well, first of all, what is logic? And what is their logic? Because you also have to maybe get into the nuance that these people tend to just define everything from like whatever the current thing or current terms or ways or definitions of words are, right? So like if you're going to debate with a leftist on a specific topic, or a progressive on a specific topic, the current words that they're using in their like dictionary of phrases or whatever might be different from what the same words meant 20 or 30 years ago, right? Or they might be newer, different words, or the concepts might be changed. And to be fair, certain words and concepts may change over time regardless, but like when Merriam-Webster added another definition, right? I've went over this in a previous episode, where if you define racism, right? If you define racism and you go to Merriam-Webster, and if up until recently this wasn't a thing, right? So there's other definitions here, and you could say, well, you could just go to the other definitions, but let's just talk about the fact that, as far as I understand, this was added during the whole George Floyd season of the early 2020s, where it's like a political or social system founded on racism and designed to execute its principles. Well, what is racism? Well, racism is defined as a political or social system founded on racism and designed to execute its principles, right? So if you have like I think Tim Pool called it like a circular definition or something like that, if you have people that are in control of the debate and dialogue that think like this, then is there even any winning that battle in whatever winning looks like? So it's like, let's just be honest and frank about what the reality of the situation is here, where it's like, I think maybe I'm realizing more as time goes on that it's not a matter of whether you're willing to it's this push and pull between just simply dominating the narrative and having like a free and open debate of ideas, in the sense of like, free and open debate is a great thing to have, and we should have it. But like when push comes to shove and we have to make a decision of what is our society going to stand on, is it possible that like everybody, like especially from the moral framework of, well, it's your truth. Like first of all, what moral framework is that? It's like, oh, it's your truth. It's whatever you think, whatever you believe. Like, how do you actually have a system in society that actually does anything long-term, complex, and productive over time? And like, how does it hold together if everything is so wishy-washy and there's no absolute truths? Or if the absolute truths can just quote unquote be done away with? It's like, if people are disconnected from reality to the extent of there being like fundamental truths and absolutes. I think it's like the denial of the absolute things, right? And so it's one of those, we might have to realize that maybe the simple fact of the matter is that you're going to actually just have to pick a hill that's worth dying on and die on it. Metaphorically speaking, but in some cases maybe it eventually comes to a literal if you're going to go through like a religious persecution, because it's like in the sense of like if the Christians become persecuted, because it's like you just have to like realize that you may just have to admit the fact that what you believe they don't and will not be convinced of, nor is there even really necessarily merit to trying to convince them through some sort of logical, secular minded debate format, and instead you're just going to have to simply say, this is what we're doing, this is what we want our society to look like. You either are going to have to get with it, or you're going to have to like go a different direction from us, or not be a part of what we're going to be doing, in the sense of like, this is going to be how our country is going to be run. We're going to do this and that. You know, you're allowed to live here, but if you're not going to get on board with this, then you are not going to be part of leading this, right? So it's like the idea of like, if you want your country to honor God, and you allow people to become part of your movement that do not honor God, where is that going to lead? Because this is kind of maybe the modern current issue, and I think this came to mind a little bit ago when we started to have like this whole like big tent idea on the right wing. And I think like when you want to win the current battles or whatever, it's like the big tent idea, there's merit to it, and like it makes sense like when you think about it. Like, the more people you can get in, the more votes you could, pool together towards a certain cause through kind of uniting or whatever and having certain factions or whatever. It's like it makes sense, but the only thing is, and there's kind of maybe like to some degree, maybe the civil war of mindsets was already taking place, but now you could argue it's taking place more so, right? I was just watching something from Pop Culture Crisis earlier, where they were talking about like this milkmaid dress thing, and how there was like the sort of liberal leaning people that voted for Trump versus the more like religious traditional or religious conservative people that voted for Trump, and they're basically kind of do you want to say duking it out on Twitter or arguing on Twitter or wherever over this dress that was being advertised, which wasn't exactly modest from what I saw at all. And so anyway, but like all this is like maybe emblematic, and they were talking about this in their kind of reaction to this debacle or whatever you want to call it, this argument, and like some of the stuff that I think the cast of the show was going over is that, or might have been Mary that brought this up, where it's like there's like this sort of like after like the election's done and over now, so then now like the people that now have won maybe are now going to be infighting over like what are we really about. That's like my like kind of quick summary of the points made maybe, and it's like, so where do you go from here, right? Because you have this big tent of a bunch of different people that all are kind of going to look at things differently and view issues differently and believe different things. So we united on this one thing that everybody kind of agreed on, which is like not being, left-wing, modern Democratic Party, etc., whatever you want to label it as, not supporting that current thing, and instead being like, we're going to go this way. But now what happens when you have this big tent, to kind of bring it back to what I was saying earlier, what happens when you have this big tent, and what is the goal and direction and perspectives that are going to win out? Because not everybody in this kind of way of looking at it is going to get everything they want when it comes to every issue. Like, not everybody's going to be able to get their way, because it's like, if we're going to decide what to promote as a culture, if it's going to just be a live and let live thing, then don't be surprised when you have a bunch of people that disagree on what we should be doing. And if everybody's trying to push the same, like, or if everybody's trying to push different things, then like, don't be surprised, because you have a big tent. So in a big tent is a lot of different viewpoints. So then when we have, if we ultimately are going to decide, okay, where is the country going to go? And I mean, like I'm talking like this, but I'm not even American, so I'm not even necessarily part of that dialogue in terms of like, where are we going to lead the country kind of thing. But if I'm going to put in my 2 cents on it, it's like, are you going to have a country that trends more in the direction of honoring God, or more in the direction of just like only giving lip service or using God as like a prop to rally the base, which is like not a good thing to do. Like, this is even, you could argue, the thing in like big tent conservatism, like not even people that would identify as liberal or anything, but it's like if you have whatever you want to call modern conservatism, right, which is a bunch of people probably differing viewpoints, it's like the one thing that's interesting is in the conservative conversation and dialogue, Christianity is never really brought up to a very deep level. It's more like they believe in Christ, they believe in God, they believe in biblical values, and then they'll say like America was founded on Judeo-Christian values. I think now people are maybe beginning to realize that Judeo values and Christian values are not necessarily the same values. That's a whole other rabbit hole for another time. But essentially, what values are you about, right? And not all Christians necessarily think the same. Not all people that call themselves Jewish necessarily think the same. So like even with those labels, what does that mean? Like, what does that mean in terms of what do you think? To come back to like the actual episode title, what do you think? Because even if you're going to be labeled conservative, even if you're going to, call yourself Christian, what do you actually think? What do you actually believe? What does that mean, right? Because if you have people in the conservative movement, because sometimes it feels like the Bible and God and Christ is brought up as this kind of prop to rally the base in terms of like, we are Christians, let's go do this thing. And in some cases, when people bring up, the Bible and God, it might actually be like in a good-hearted manner and actually in a good way. But I think it's worth noting, that sometimes when people bring things up, it might just be kind of like this, we're going to play to the Christian crowd by talking about God. but it's really just to kind of rally the base. But it's like, do you actually care about God and what God thinks? Do you actually care about what is the will of the Father, right? And I don't have all the answers either, but it's like, what is the perspective and what is your actual motive? What is your motivating factors? What is your heart attitude in doing that, and why you're doing that, right? Who is it about? What is it all about, right? So it's good to keep that in mind, because that's kind of the thing I'm realizing a bit more when I just kind of look back a little bit over the last maybe 3 or so years. It's like, is God more than just something you bring up to rally the base? And is it actually first and foremost about God and what God wants, right? And that should be something that should be asked just as much towards myself as everybody else. You know, like, what is the goal? Why do we do what we do? It's like the VeggieTales intro, why we do what we do. Why are we doing what we are doing? What is the goal? What is the will of the Father? What does God want us to do? Are we actually honoring God? Do we actually care about what God thinks? It's like what my buddy Mark said in the past, where it's like, do we even care what God thinks, or do we care what Jesus thinks? Whatever it was that he said, something along those lines. Like, do we actually care about what God thinks? So I'll kind of bring the episode to conclusion on that. What do you think? Are you willing to actually realize the subtle psyops in the conversational debate dialogue? And are you willing to actually talk about things boldly from a standard foundation of biblical truth, rather than just this vague, ever-changing system of logic, or modern day logic, or your truth versus my truth, whatever, trying to like appeal to modern day things? Like, what is the standard? And this is kind of, if anything, maybe me talking or addressing my own like thoughts here, like in the sense of like, maybe I'm saying this to myself in a way, because it's like, what do I think? Am I doing these things? Maybe it's kind of like a self-check or something like that. But anyway, I'll end that there.